Hi everyone. I'm going to go through lecture 2 or the first content lecture, if you want to call it that. I'm going to go through Unit 1 and Chapters 1 and 2 of the Green Book, which I quickly touched on in our previous lecture in Mabeleng Hall. So I'm going to just go through all the content, mostly theory, but I'm just going to explain the main aspects of this section. So looking at Unit 1, we're looking at the introduction to cost management and basically looking at the history of where the QS function came from and a bit of history of it. Like I said, the history is not that important, but we're still going to go through that so that you've got an understanding of where everyone fits in. And throughout the module, I'll also allude to what the functions are of all the different role players. Okay, so the main thing that we're going to try or look at in this unit is to understand the roles of the professionals on the team, relate the architect and the quantity surveyor's dependence on each other, and conceptualize the advantage of the QS that it brings to the project. We're going to look at the historical overview and then quantity surveying in South Africa. Like I mentioned, it's chapters 1 and 2 of Maritz and Sigley, the Green Book, and we're first going to look at the historical overview. So getting started, the origins of a quantity surveyor. It has always been the client and the contractor. So what you've learned from construction contracts, which you had with Mr. Huggett, basically is that there's a contract between the client and the contractor. There's no contract between the architect or the professional team with the contractor. In the South African law, usually, depending, obviously you can have that, but for our purposes, we're just going to look at the normal standard arrangements of most projects as per the JBCC. The FIDIC usually works like that, the NEC and the GCC as well. So we're not going to focus on a turnkey type of contract where the contractor appoints the professional team to do the design for him on behalf of the client. So we're just going to focus on the traditional contracts arrangements. So in the olden days, we used to have a master builder. In loose terms, the entire professional team was covered by the master builder. So he did the design. He even at the early stages, he was the builder as well. So he did the design, the building, and everything on behalf of the client. So over time, that changed. So the QS actually dates from the 19th century in England and was known as surveyors. If you look at the profession in Britain still, you're a chartered surveyor when you're a QS in Britain, although the term QS has been adopted as well. So it's a surveyor is used in a loose term in that area. Not to get confused with a land surveyor, which is the person that actually does the measurements of the site and so on. Okay, they were mostly used by the master tradesman to calculate final costs, and then the owner did not like this and wanted to know the cost beforehand. So later on, the clients wanted to get a quote before they actually started construction. So the contractors had to submit quotations and had to measure the drawings themselves, and only the winning tenderer would be able to recover that cost and the time that he put into that tender or quote that he had to prepare. So tenderers then pulled together for measurements and shared the cost by adding it to their tender price, and a certain amount of collusion actually took place. Then what happened was the client caught on to this and appointed their own surveyors to look at their own interest, and then through the Commonwealth quantity surveyor, the profession spread throughout the world. In America, for instance, you don't get quantity surveyors, you get cost engineers, which just basically does the same as a quantity surveyor. So looking at quantity surveying in South Africa, it was mostly influenced by the political and economical changes. Agricultural, South Africa moved from an agricultural based economy to a mining economy, which stimulated a lot of growth. And in the 1870s, diamonds were discovered and gold in 1886, which had a big influence on how things were done in South Africa. So early influences by architects. So the mining activities attracted a lot of architects from overseas to come to South Africa with the gold rush and the diamonds that was found. Mainly came from Britain and settled in Joburg and Pretoria and in the coastal towns also. They had some experience of quantity surveying, but they used to do it themselves. Okay, so you can see there was a need, and then the architects fulfilled that need. It was mostly found lacking and started in, what happened was architects started specializing in quantities, and then in 1896 fully qualified QSs started to arrive also from overseas. And then the war happened in 1899 up to 1902. And then after the Union of South Africa in 1910, the war and the Depression had prolonged effect on the industry, and the Union Public Works was established, which included architects and QSs afterwards. The London method of measurements were adopted, and with the advent of more complex buildings, added emphasis was put on to measurement information. So the more complex the projects became, the more important the quantities actually started to become. Okay, and then voluntary associations was formed in 1905, the Transvaal Society of Quantity Surveying. In 1908, it developed into the South African Institute of Quantity Surveying and became affiliated with the Chartered Surveys Institute of Britain, these days called RICS, the Royal Institute of Quantity Surveyors. In 1926, architects and quantity surveyors' name were protected by the Architect and Quantity Surveyors Private Act, only the names and not the function. Okay, so you could still practice as a QS or an architect, although you didn't use the term architect or QS. Okay. Then the Institute of South African Architects, ISAA, incorporated the QS, incorporated QSs in the association. Then the Second World War happened. Steady growth through the 1930s, and the Second World War, people left the offices for the war, so everything basically stood still for a while. After the war, consideration was given to those that had served, and students were accommodated also accordingly. Preference was also given to firms with active serving members. So you can see how it influenced the profession, the war as well. Then the Republic of South Africa, 1961, 31 May, had a little effect on the different chapters of the association. And then in 1970, a new act was published and the South African Council of Quantity Surveyors came into effect. Okay, so you can see the first mention of council started, together with the Architectural Act. So This is basically where a fully fledged council for the architects and for the QSs started. There was the association and the council with the common interest and administration by the Association for Architects. So you can see the two councils existed, but the architects and the QSs were still served by a single association. Then in 2000, the Construction Built Environment was introduced, which included the Quantity Surveyors Act, and this is basically what we're going to focus on. So this is very important. All of the rest is just background to what we're going to do here. So it is after 2000, and we're still governed by mostly the 2000 regulations that govern the different role players in the construction industry, and where under which all of the association or all of the councils fall. So this diagram is very important in your book, and you will definitely get a question some other time on this. You should know that there's a council for the QSs, for architects, engineers, which is EXA, for landscape architects, and then the council for project management, which is the SACP-CMP, and then the council for property valuers as well. Okay, and then what you can see is all of them fall underneath the council for the built environment. Okay, the main function of these councils is to regulate people registered, and it's to protect the public, to protect the professions, and to assist in the training and education of people wanting to register as a professional QS or architect. These councils all report to the minister. It is reviewed by the built environment and coordination liaison with key statutory bodies, like for instance the competition commission, etc., etc., and then review of appeals arising from disciplinary hearings. There's a couple of people that do practice without the necessary registration, and many of them are prosecuted and or stripped of the professional registration if they did anything illegal. Okay, so the short and the long of it is that there's certain rules that you have to adhere to. You can't overcharge a client for services rendered. You should be fair. You can't go and steal other projects from other professionals. That type of thing is basically regulated by the councils. Okay, then we get into the SAC QSP specifically. It is a compulsory, so as we've established already, any PRQS has to be registered with the council, and then the council manages the profession on behalf of the Minister of Public Works. In the Act, the following arrangements are also in place: the accreditation of programs and educational institutions, like our department here is also accredited with the SAC QSP, same as what the architectural department is accredited with SACAP. And then legislation, general financial reporting is also provided by the council. Protection to the public is given. Registration, registered persons are listed, so anyone can go have a look whether someone is actually registered. A recognition of voluntary associations, like the Association of the South African Quantity Surveying Profession, it's the same as SAIA. And then this discipline is enforced, and then the fees are regulated by the council. Then the association, I just put in this clip or this differentiation, like I mentioned in class, there's a difference between the council. The council is the one that you actually want to be registered with, whereas the association is the one that just gives you more information and adds value to you as a professional. Okay, then the building information modeling. I'm not going to go into this. I've basically said what I wanted to say in class, but the main thing is we've still got a bit of a way to still go. So I just put in the different levels of BIM information here for you, where quantity surveying falls within 5D BIM, programming is 4D BIM, and then engineers, architects, the actual model developing is 3D BIM. Lifecycle planning is 6D BIM, and this is one that the facilities managers usually use. Is once a building is complete, more software can be incorporated into the model to actually assist with the maintenance of a building. Okay, and then you can have a look at this different chart. You might experience this differently, but I just put this in to give you a bit of a guideline of any new technology that we go through. We go through a process of a bit of a hype. This new technology can solve a lot of problems. Then you realize you need to actually implement it, and then we go a little bit backwards, and then we realize if we use it smartly, we can actually improve our processes. So this is more or less the loop that we go through for each new technology that is implemented. Okay, and then we've got that little video that explained what the professions are, and then there's a link here that you can copy and paste in your URL that you can actually then you can watch the video again. Okay, so what we want to try and do here is to establish that each design, getting the scope from the client is very important. So he might want a sports car, but if you want to go certain places, you can't use that sports car to go everywhere. So it might be that a client wants a big flashy building, but is it going to be practical for him? So that is something that we always have to assess. So it has to be fit for purpose. Cost controls starts at the design of a new building. Okay, very important to take note is the end building, the functions, getting the occupation service in place from the start is very important. Getting that all the necessary design into the building. It doesn't matter that you have a building standing, but if you can't sign off the electrical installation or the mechanical installation or the ventilation also, or in this case the fire escape, which is required for buildings of this size, then the whole project can fall flat because of it not being in the design and within the budget. So one has to think about everything before you actually kick off the project. Okay, and then yeah, what do you think? You can send through any feedback if you think if you've got questions or so. Okay, then we start with chapter 2, the roles and the functions. So we're going to go into it in a little bit more detail. Services provided by the cost engineer or QS, cost advisor, whatever you want to call it, with comprehensive knowledge of the construction industry. He has to have some sort of experience in the construction industry to enable him to give you advice. He advises on the size, the standard, and the cost of the project. He looks at the economic scale. The main thing is to fit within the budget. Or looking at the budget, what can we build within this budget, etc. So collaboration and cooperation with other members of the design team. This is a good function that the QS usually brings to the table. because they have to put the cost together from the engineers and everyone, so they have a big influence on the risk management already, and the QS actually has a big function to play within the broader terms of project management, because they are the first people that actually try and make this project feasible, and to do that you have to think what would the engineers bring, what else is needed, the practical side of the project. So the tender procedures and the contracts, also a very strong function that the QS brings to the table. And then preparation of tender documentation, it's probably one of the biggest things that the QS brings to the table is the actual documentation that goes out on tender, and then the implementation of financial control. Then services provided, day-to-day, cost estimate budgets, and other information in the design stage, bills and other types of pricing documents, other procurement documentation, elemental and other standard forms of cost planning, what we're going to look at in this module. Tender evaluations, valuation of monthly payment certificates, final accounts, calculations and price fluctuations, comes in with cost controls, variations on statements, same, also cost control, variation on work done, certification, also cost control. Then other professional services is specialized projects, advice. It depends on what you're exposed to and what your experience is. Negotiation of rates with the contractor if for some other reason there's something new or something changed, the QS usually negotiates with the contractor. Cost plus and lump sum projects, project quantities and engineering work on other types of BOQs, financial and feasibility studies, possible returns on investment, act as principal agent on projects, value buildings for insurance purposes, interpret construction contracts. He can act as an expert witness, and they participate in all forms of dispute resolutions. Just the cost and lump sum projects, just to elaborate on this a little bit, where you have projects where you've got a certain budget and then the contractor just add costs, or where it's a lump sum project, they usually control those type of projects through putting some sort of documentation together and negotiation and monitoring what the cost would be. They basically check whether the cost that's provided, whether it's not outlandish or out of the ballpark, and a strong sense of negotiation also goes hand in hand with that. Something extra in practice, when you appoint a QS, look at this, the QS fees. So this is what we're going to look at the different functions of the QS. I'm not going to run through all of them. They are stipulated in the study notes and is fairly straightforward and self-explanatory. So looking at project management, and this is what we showed, what I showed already. Basically what you need to take away from this slide is that we are governed by the 6 stages of project management, and we've got stages 1 to 6, and we will still elaborate on that. Okay, so we've got the inception, design, development, implementation and all construction, and commissioning or handover to the client. Okay, so just to look at the risk factor, the farther the project progresses, the higher the risk. So your cost of making any changes has a low impact. So if you make a change at the beginning of a project, your cost of making that change is quite low. As you progress through the project, your risk of cost implications goes up. Then the stakeholder influence risk or uncertainty, when you start out on a project, your risk from stakeholders is quite high because you're still establishing what the scope is. Remember that slide between the Burj Khalifa and a small house? It really makes a big difference on what the client actually wants, and do they have, for instance, a simple thing is, are the stakeholders or the client actually the owner of that plot of land? That type of information you need to gather, and here, does this person really have the funds to fund this project? Is there a communal buy-in into this development or not? That's the type of risks that is involved, and that lessens as the project goes down. If the more information you get, the less that risk becomes. But then we look at the work environment. We work in on buildings. The QS works on buildings, civil work. QS, you've got civil QSs that works on roads, pipeline installations, sewage, and so forth, and other engineering services. You get QSs that specialize only in plumbing, depending on the size of the projects usually. Okay, then we look at the procurement processes. One of the most important functions of the QS is to provide a basis on which progress and payments are done. The main reason why we develop bills of quantities, and why I say bills of quantities, is because a bill comprises a whole lot of bills, separate bills: earthworks, masonry, metalwork, roofs, tiling, painting, etc. that forms part of your bills of quantities. Okay, then that is usually a big portion of your contract documentation, because the cost or the estimate or the quote from the contractor is based on that. So the BOQ with schedules, you get different types of BOQs. You've got BOQs with schedules of rates, where the contractor, the quantities isn't necessarily measured, but the rates of the contractors are given and then just applied as more information gets available. You have lump sum contracts, where contractors just give a lump sum for the project. Many home builds are like that, where the drawings are given to a contractor and they give a price. Okay, it will cost me 8,000 Rand per square meter to build this building. It will cost you 1.5 million, and that is in the cost. That is a lump sum cost given. It's not broken down into different elements or items. And then you've got cost plus contracts. These contracts are usually contracts where the client provides material, and then the contractor adds a certain amount on top of that for labor or so only. Then you've got package or design and build or turnkey type of projects, where the contractor basically does everything, very similar to the lump sum contract, but the design and so on is done by the contractor himself. So where the term turnkey comes from is the client just asks, I want this type of building, I just want a key to start the building or open a building and take occupation of the house or the building. Okay, then we look at the different stages. Okay, I'm not going to go through this because this is quite mundane, and what you should have a look at is please read through all of the items that the QS is supposed to do within the inception. I'm just going to scroll down to the outcome. Okay, so at the end, the scope is agreed after stage 1. The agreed services is decided, and the signed client QS service level agreement is signed. Look at again here, the scope of the services is defined. So he still advises on the economic factors, like if you want to do a certain type of development between a residential house and a commercial house. There's certain factors that has to be taken into account. The cost per square meter also has an influence, etc. Then in stage 2, oh, sorry, yes, okay, I just had some examples of stage 1. So usually in stage 1, the professional team is identified, although the professional team can grow as you go through the design process, and when you see, okay, we need a mechanical engineer, a design and install mechanical installation won't necessarily work on this project. Okay, and then I just added, I think it's from stage 2, just some examples. So concept and viability, this is a very important stage in the project. So agreeing the documentation program for the contract. So the program is decided on, attending design consultancy agreement of meetings, reviewing the evaluation concept in conjunction with the professional team. Are we going to build a 300 square meter house, or are we going to build a 100 square meter house? That type of decisions. Receiving relevant data from cost estimates. So are we going to build a masonry building? Are we going to build a lightweight steel building? These type of decisions are taken. Okay, preparation of preliminary and elemental or equivalent estimations of the cost, depending on the availability of information. Assisting the client in preparing financial report. Auditing space allocations, against initial brief. Is the occupation schedule from the client, is it going to meet the requirements? If he wants a 30 key hotel, will his budget allow him to build a 30 key hotel or not? Liaison with and cooperation with providing necessary information to the client, principal consultant and or professional consultant. And for which the following deliverables are available. So these are the deliverables of stage 2: a preliminary estimate, elemental equivalent estimate depending on the availability of information, space allocation audits, and yeah, that is what the outcome of stage 2 is. So looking at stage 3, oh, this is stage 2. This is just the example. This is a project that we had in BlackRock. We got the following type of design, just a concept that was given to the client. So we didn't have a lot of detail. What we could do, we were provided with a basic layout of the project, and we could actually measure all of the different elements, all connecting it to the rate per square meter calculations, and all of those rates were determined for each function. So we had a little radio station here which was a bit higher. The rate was also higher because of the square meter. So as your square meter dimensions get smaller, the higher the rate usually becomes, just because of the amount of work that goes into it. If you think about a guardhouse, the rate per square meter is quite high, although there's not that much detail that goes into it, but it still needs a strip footing, it still needs earth filling, it still needs a wall, roof, some electrical installation. So that is the type of considerations when you do your per square meter rate build up. Okay, and then obviously applying that. So this is just a summary of that type of calculation, and then we highlighted the items that cost a lot to the client. So the structural installation, the paving and the roadworks actually took up a lot of the installation cost for this specific project. You also see that a 10% contingency is allowed because not all of the information is available yet. There's a certain amount of uncertainty built into the estimate usually. Okay, and then we built in some escalation for the client, taking into account when the project will actually come off and the program, and then VAT is just added to that to get to estimate. Okay, and this is just the square meter calculations or measurements that was done. Okay, and then we get to the design stage, and this is where the meat is actually put onto the bones. Again, review the documentation and program, attend the design meetings again, review, evaluation the design layout. Is there now suddenly something like a centralized air conditioning system that's going to be added to the project, which will take the cost up considerably? Is there much many services that has to be added for this project? Does rezoning have to be done? That type of things. Okay, sourcing of information, preparing detailed estimation of construction cost, assisting the client in reviewing the financial viability of the project. Will this project actually be able to generate the income? Commenting on space allocations again, liaison with and cooperation with the providing necessary information to the client on the principal consultant and other professions. Is there any information still outstanding from any of the professionals that might influence these decisions? And the outcomes is a detailed estimation, usually an elemental estimate. Area schedule is provided, and yeah, that's usually the outcome of stage 3. And then this is a typical detail that you usually get. At least now you can see the number of toilets or the installation, what type of finishes will be used. Is this is now ablution block? Will there be surface drainage within the ablution or not? Okay, and then you can do a price comparison. For instance, on this project, we looked at different phases for the project. If we phased the project, for instance, there was the existing building that we wanted to keep, we wanted to decide, or the client wanted to decide whether to demolish that building and just start from scratch, or build a building on a separate site and then convert the existing building or ablution into office space or so. So we just gave him a whole lot of different options in this case. Then we get to documentation and procurement, and this is probably where most of the time of the QS is spent. The main thing here is to get to a budget or tender documents with bills of quantities that can actually be used so that you can call tenders and evaluate them to give the client a recommendation for the best contractor to be appointed. And price contract documentation, which becomes a legal document for the client. Okay, a whole lot of documentation. Then we get to construction. Okay, and I'm not going to go through this too much depth. I just want to go to the last one, and there we go. So the schedule of predicted cash flow is usually given. Estimate of the proposed variations. So if there's changes, the QS usually checks whether it's within the budget and maybe there's a saving, maybe there's some extra costs that comes on. Financial cost control reports, valuation for payment certificates, and progressive and draft final accounts. Now the final accounts we'll get into later on, but this is the final cost that is signed by the client and the contractor, saying, okay, this project is done, this is what is outstanding to the contractor, or this is something which is due to the client. Okay, and then I just added the slide on what everyone thinks we do on site to what we actually do on site. Is we have a whole lot of meetings and discussions and do a lot of number crushing. Here, what information is outstanding, what drawing still needs to be issued, where we will have challenges connecting to the existing services, and so forth and so forth. Okay, and then here's the slide that relates to that initial scope. Are we going to build this type of building? Or are we going to tackle a major project where a whole lot of expertise is needed? Then we get to the closeout. I'm just going to run through these. It basically comes down to the final account, valuation of payment certificates, and then the final account. And if the QS does his work throughout the project, this is usually a smooth process because the final account is already done before the project is actually closed out. There's no back and forth between him and the contractor, and negotiations and so on is usually sorted out. And then, very importantly, the final account is then used by the QS whenever he does new calculations for a new project. Okay, and then this is what you want to try and avoid with postponing your final account, is to sort it out early on. Okay, so what we try and do is a constant calculation of buildings, keeping the as-built up to date as we go along. A whole lot of paperwork, administration, and keeping track of everything that goes on is very important. And then reporting, unfortunately, we have to keep up to date. And then at the end, we give over the keys to the client. All the keys are marked for which door, and that's also quite a long process, but in the end, that's how the key is handed over to the client. Thanks everyone. Remember to send through any questions if you do have, and yeah, hope to see you guys again.